Throughout history, the USA and the USSR have been in constant competition with one another. While the US was trying to stop the spread of communism, the USSR was doing the very opposite. Their actions always resulted in a tug-of-war effect with the other. This type of competition can be seen as who can influence the other nations the most. They were considered the two main superpowers, and they would do everything they could to be one step ahead of the other. This did not just stop at their attempts to spread their political beliefs, but even went into other things, such as the competition between spacecrafts. This began during World War II when the V-2 rocket was used by Germany in missile attacks during the final years of the war. Even though it wasn't very effective at the time, both the US and the Soviet Union realized that this technology could be an advantage to their military. Therefore, after World War II, they each recruited the finest rocket scientists from Germany to help with their research and designs. The space race began in 1955 when both countries announced that they would soon be launching satellites into orbit. The Soviets took the US announcement as a challenge and even established a commission whose goal was to beat the US in putting a satellite into space. The Americans may have simply thought their technology was superior and incapable of being beaten by the Soviets, since they'd always been slightly ahead of the Soviets in the case of military technology. However, by August 1957, the Soviets proved the US's assumption false when they successfully tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile known as the R-7, which was later used on October 4, 1957, to launch Sputnik 1. At this point, the Soviets had taken the lead in the space race. It wasn't that the US was intimidated by the size or power of Sputnik 1, since it was only a small metal ball that was less than 2 feet in diameter, but it was the fact that the technology to launch a nuclear missile at any location was in the power of their opponent. Realizing this, Eisenhower ordered the Navy to launch a satellite as soon as possible. So on December 6, 1957, the Vanguard TV-3 satellite was ready for takeoff, or so they thought. Only a few seconds after being launched did the satellite come crashing to the ground. This was a huge embarrassment for the U.S. It had taken the U.S. 4 months after the launch of Sputnik 1 to finally successfully launch their own satellite called the Explorer 1. As this may have been a nice achievement for the U.S., it wasn't long until the Soviets had unmatched them again. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets had made the first man, Yuri Gagarin, to go into space and orbit around the Earth in the spacecraft Vostok 1. It had taken the U.S. 3 weeks after this Soviet achievement before they could launch Freedom 7 and the astronaut Alan Shepard into space. Unfortunately, they were unable to orbit the Earth until almost a year later by the use of Friendship 7 spacecraft on February 20, 1962. During this time the U.S. was attempting to launch the Friendship 7, the Soviets were able to accomplish other missions that they had. The Americans were embarrassed at being behind in the space race. Therefore, in 1961, President Kennedy decided that the only way to outdo the Soviets was to be the first nation to put a man on the moon. He felt this was important for the country and also the Western world. Thus, the Apollo moon program was put into motion, and after many years of research, experiments, test flights, and training, the Apollo 11 spacecraft was launched into space on July 16, 1969. And on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon. This accomplishment made a huge mark in the space race and in history overall. The space race began to die down with the improved relations between the Soviet President Brezhnev and the U.S. President Nixon. They decided it would be best to move from cooperation rather than competition. This cooperation can be marked by the first U.S.-Soviet joint mission in July of 1975, called the Apollo-Soyuz project. This joint mission was to have the U.S. Apollo spacecraft join with the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft. And once the spacecrafts met, the two crews shook hands, carried out joint experiments, and even exchanged gifts. This marked the end of the space race in 1975. Whenever the USSR would accomplish something such as the successful launch of Sputnik, or launching the first man into space, the U.S. felt that they had to do the same or outmatch them, which can be seen when Kennedy felt the need to be the first out of the two superpowers to place a man on the moon. Some may say that this spacecraft competition, also known as the space race, was a waste of time and money. However, others might see the fact that the space race is actually responsible for much of the technology we have today. Some examples of this technology are satellite TVs, laptops, smoke detectors, ear thermometers, and many more. Overall, it is clear that the US and the USSR have been in constant competition throughout the Cold War. Not only was this seen in the way they tried to politically influence other nations more than the other, but also in the way they attempted to outdo each other throughout the lengths of the space race.